What is your definition of malingering?
Deliberate faking of symptoms for an external goal.
It's a conscious effort to deceive.
That's correct.
And that is a research interest of yours, isn't it?
That's correct.
And your research interest is detecting, I'll just say the word, liars who are trying to seek a monetary gain in a litigation context.
That's a short snippet from a 2-hour video, YouTube video I watched, and it was in regard to a personal injury case. And I would like the purpose of this video is to comment on it, which is part of the fair use. I want to get that out right up front. And, you know, I want to analyze some of the tactics used by this neuropsychologist. Nonprofit educational personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use. Please bear with me just a moment. I don't want to bore you to tears, but I want to point out one study that a part of the study was Kyle Brower Boone, who is listed on this, was a part of a study titled Apparent Effects of Type of Compensation Seeking Disability versus Litigation on Performances Validity Test Scores may be due to other factors. A couple things I just want to point out. There's some terminology here, and one is PVTs, Performance Validity Tests, and ADLs, Activity of Daily Living. And it states failure on at least 2 performance validity tests and a lack of congruency between their low cognitive scores and normal function and activity of daily living. And it goes on to state mental health diagnoses were more likely to feign or exaggerate a wide variety of cognitive deficits, whereas those who claim medical diagnoses, traumatic brain injury, were more targeted in their attempts to feign or exaggerate neurocognitive compromise. And they bring up the term traumatic brain injury, and we all know what a concussion is. This is like it's being very recognized in contact sports, football, professional wrestling, boxing, and especially repeated injuries can cause permanent and progressive brain injury. I mean, these are just, as far as I know, something strongly looked into. Now, it's not to say there is or there's fakers out there. I recognize that. But part of my issue with this study is activities of daily living is more or less like when you your brain goes on autopilot, where you're accustomed to these type activities. And the performance validity test is like putting the person more or less on the spot. They're going to perform something that they're not so much accustomed to. So this is where I kind of take issue with it. I mean, how can they possibly, lack of a better term, crawl inside somebody's head? Kyle Boone is the person being disposed in this personal injury case, by the way. And I also want to bring up something else. This came up in a earlier video I did, and this is done by Neuropsychiatry, and they're talking about atypical depression. And I just want to point out, you know, are they properly screening for a physiological, another underlying condition. And this one was, I mean, I just got to point it out. They're talking about atypical depression with reverse vegetative signs. I mean, what kind of medical terminology is that? And they describe it as having hyperphagia and hypersomnia, which is overeating and oversleeping. But what, you know, and they're talking about the ADLs, activity of daily living, in regard to this vegetative condition. But what I want to point out is that, you know, they're talking about fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue are mentioned in this, as well as a dysfunction of the HPA axis. And what they're not what they're not doing or following up on is actually testing the patient's HPA axis, but they get into uh, hypofunction, a low functioning of the HPA, and also a hyperfunction, and this is in regard to Cushing's, too much cortisol, and that's part of the HPA. And it states this has similarity to Cushing's disease, where a suppression of central HPA system activity is accompanied by features of AD and pain in a considerable number of patients. Well, number one, they don't know what they're talking about. It's not a suppressed HPA system. It's a hyperfunction. It's too much cortisol. And they go on to state opposite vegetative features might therefore be related to the opposite dysregulation of the APA system. Could you, anybody, please tell me what that means with all those double negatives? It is, the reason I'm pointing this out is, like, what information are they relying on? I mean, this is so weak. Yes, it's old, but this is what's out there. They go on to state which drugs to throw at it to, quote, treat the symptoms. Come on. Okay, on to Kyle Brower Boone, PhD in neuropsychology. She is deposed by an attorney, again in regard to a personal injury case, and she is hired by the insurance company to discredit the patient, the person that was injured. And in brief, you know, I made clips to demonstrate how she blames the patient, and, you know, she'll sidestep issues by saying, I don't remember, or it's out of my area of expertise. She also regards herself as the best expert ever because she knows more than anybody else treating the guy, or and has had experience with him. And I will suggest she does it for monetary rewards, being hired by the insurance company to discredit this man. And I would describe this as a mercenary, and that she does this at the expense of ethics and purely for material rewards. So we will continue. We'll get into it. The gentleman that was injured had some pretty serious facial lacerations, and they show us pictures, so words of warning. They'll warn you ahead of time, so if you really don't want to see it, you know, avert your eyes for a few seconds. And also, I just want to congratulate the attorney because he does a smackdown. It's really does my heart good to see someone put her in her place for what her tactics are all about.
Was Mr. Rios struck in the face by a high-speed projectile?
Yes.
Have you seen these photographs?
I believe I did.
Hold it up to the camera, please. I know you're not a medical doctor, but what's your take about that? Was he injured in this accident?
Yes.
Did she just violate the Business and Professions Code with that?
I'll put it this way. Does he have a medical history that suggests that he was injured when he was struck in the face with a high-speed projectile?
Yes, he sustained injury.
Does the evidence suggest in the record that the blow resulted in multiple skull fractures, and that's plural?
Facial fractures, yes.
Was a skull fracture? You understand the difference between skull and face?
Well, it's bony structures on the front of the skull, yes.
Did he have multiple skull fractures now?
He had multiple fractures on the head, yes.
Did he have a fracture of the C7 vertebral body?
I believe so.
Do you understand the mechanism, how you can get your neck broken when you're hit in the face with a high-speed projectile?
I have no personal knowledge of that, no expertise in that.
You ever heard of coup contre coup?
Yes, I have.
Do you believe he suffered a coup contre coup?
In terms of a brain injury?
In terms of any type of injury in his body as reported by history?
That would be out of my area of expertise if we're talking about his neck.
When Mr. Rios was struck in the head with the high-speed projectile, did he suffer bleeding below the dura?
I believe that there was some blood detected.
That's also known as a subdural hematoma?
Correct.
Was that in the falx? That's F-A-L-X.
Yes.
Where's the falx?
It's the area between the two hemispheres. There's a piece of connective tissue that comes down between the two hemispheres.
That's in the frontal lobes, correct?
Well, actually, the falx goes all the way between the two hemispheres, but it's my understanding that the blood was in the frontal area.
In the frontal lobes of the human brain, what does it control?
Things like planning, organization, thinking through consequences, generating ideas, motor function.
Executive functions.
That's correct.
I mean, it's kind of like what makes people people, right?
Well, all of our thinking skills makes people people. Language makes people people.
But in terms of personality, mood, expressing yourself, things like that, is that in the frontal lobes?
To some extent.
Based upon your understanding, was enough force applied to the blood vessels under the dura to cause a shearing injury and cause those vessels to bleed?
That would be out of my area of expertise.
Is it out of your area of expertise to know that there was sufficient force applied to blood vessels on his brain to the point where the vessels failed and bled?
That would be out of my area of expertise.
Is it true that data show that MRI, CTs many times cannot pick up a mild traumatic brain injury? You just don't see it.
That's true.
Is your understanding it's there, but the resolution in our technology just can't see it yet?
It may be there, it may not be there.
I'm talking about situations where it is in fact there.
Counsel, you have pens right.
There are data show that there are in fact, it's proven, you can have a mild traumatic brain injury and it will not show on MR or CT imaging because the resolution cannot pick up the injury.
That would be out of my area of expertise.
You've read that somewhere?
Well, it's actually very controversial, whether or not, what the underlying pathology would be in.
Dr. Horshak was the treating neurosurgeon, and he gave a deposition in this case.
If it's here, then
It's not there, and it's
then
not
I-
on the list.
then I didn't receive it.
Did you receive any information that Dr. Horshak, in his deposition, said that Mr. Rios, by his personal observation, had a bruised brain on imaging in the frontal lobe and was diagnosed with a traumatic brain injury? I mean, it's the diagnosis in the chart. Did you receive that information?
Well, I didn't receive his deposition.
Did you receive the, I know that, but did you receive information, since you haven't been supplied his deposition, that that's in sum and substance what he said? The guy had a brain bruise, he had a subdural hematoma, skull fractures, and he was diagnosed with those magic words, traumatic brain injury, in the chart.
I have no recollection of that right now.
Just to clarify, the high-speed projectile was a piece of equipment the gentleman was using on the job that hit his face at a very high velocity. And I also want you to take note how she minimized facial fractures as not to be confused with a skull fracture. The face is a part of the skull, gang. So, you know, that's a tactic she uses.
Is gliosis and the etiology of gliosis a medical diagnosis?
I don't know that that's true.
Gliosis is scarring in the brain?
Yes.
Is gliosis a medical condition?
Yes, it would be.
Do you feel that your license allows you to make a diagnosis of the cause or causes of gliosis in a patient that you are evaluating?
Well, let me back up. What I said was that those findings would be most consistent with the findings that we see in long-standing blood pressure. I've done research in that area. I know that literature. So you will not see in my report where I say diagnosis and then list it. But I know, as a professional who's done research in this area, that the most likely cause of periventricular white matter abnormalities on brain imaging would be vascular factors. And it has nothing to do with this business code. It has to do with the scientific literature that I've contributed to.
We'll
It doesn't say in my report diagnosis equal...
Doctor, in your report, you come to a conclusion as to the cause or probable cause, in your opinion,
Yes.
as a psychologist, of a medical condition known as gliosis in the human brain, correct?
Yes.
Would you agree that that is a medical diagnosis?
It's a medical condition, but I can comment on what the most likely cause of that is, absolutely based on my experience.
Doctor, I understand that you can. I'm asking you, do you understand that that's a violation of the business code? It's
I
a violation
disagree.
of your license.
I disagree. I'm not providing medical diagnoses. I'm saying based on the literature that I've contributed to, the most likely cause of white matter abnormalities on brain imaging would be the long-term effects of things like high blood pressure and diabetes. That's a known fact in the literature, and I am absolutely able to put that in my report.
Summary and integration. Mr. Rios has recovered substantially but incompletely from his injuries on 1/18/2010, both physically and psychologically. He has residual visual, sensory, pain, memory, attention, and emotional problems discussed below, subject, of course, to the scope of practice limitations. Do you agree with any of that?
I do not. Well, obviously he has visual problems. That is true.
On page 31, Dr. Larson states, using the pre-2005 guidelines, Mr. Rios appears to have the following limitations based on his evaluation: minimally to mild impaired in the ability to understand, remember, and complete simple commands. Do you agree or disagree?
I disagree.
Number 2, mildly to moderately impaired in the ability to do, understand, remember, and complete complex commands. Do you agree or disagree with Dr. Larson?
Disagree.
Number 3, minimally to mildly impaired in the ability to interact appropriately with supervisors, coworkers, or the public. Agree or disagree?
That may be true.
4, minimally impaired in the ability to comply with job rules such as safety and attendance. Agree or disagree?
Well, not from a cognitive standpoint, but from a personality standpoint, there are results indicating that he has issues with authority figures and may not follow recommendations. So if we're talking from a psychological standpoint, perhaps he does not comply with job rules.
Number 5,
Okay, the gentleman had a blow to the face, hard enough to break his neck and cause a brain bleed. And Kyle Boone, PhD, is a disagreement with the result of this injury, as well as virtually everybody else that the patient was in contact with, again demonstrating she knows it all. Is that it, or does she have ulterior motives? Okay, next, we'll get a load on what Kyle Boone thinks is the cause of his brain injury. And you know what? It really is a load.
And he indicated he could hear his heart beating in his chest. So he has had poorly controlled high blood pressure.
Let me get this straight. You gleaned from the record that he wrote something where he had an incident where he was upset and he could feel his heart beating, that it was indication of long-standing hypertension?
No, the records indicate long-standing hypertension, that he was diagnosed with it at age 30. But in the records, he wrote a memo to a doctor saying, essentially, oh my God, my blood pressure's up. I can feel my chest, my heart beating in my chest.
The patient's subjective belief about his blood pressure in a note where he was upset, you're taking that as evidence of uncontrolled hypertension? Am I getting that right?
No. There are other references to uncontrolled high blood pressure, as well as readings in the records that are high. Plus, the patient then, in 2009, writes a letter saying, my blood pressure is going up, I can feel it in my chest.
On an incident.
What do you mean on an incident?
Ma'am, that's the letter I referred to earlier. It seemed to be pretty coherent and an intelligent person writing it, not some unsophisticated person.
I didn't say he was unsophisticated.
No, and that's the letter I'm referring to, where he said he got so upset about being treated poorly in a doctor's office, he got upset and he could feel his heart racing. Oh. Did you opine in your report that he has diabetic neuropathy in his hands?
I believe so.
You understand he has carpal tunnel syndrome, had it surgically
That's correct.
corrected, and he doesn't have it anymore?
That's correct.
What do you make of that? Is that diabetic neuropathy?
No.
He does not have diabetic neuropathy.
Well, somewhere in the records I saw reference to that.
Well, doctor, are you diagnosing this man with diabetic neuropathy?
No.
Do you believe he has diabetic neuropathy?
I believe I saw it referred to in the records.
Did you see that it was in fact carpal tunnel syndrome, which was surgically treated, and he doesn't have tingling anymore in his hands?
No, I saw references to both carpal tunnel syndrome and peripheral neuropathy in the records.
And doctor, it's true, is it not, that you pulled that out of the record and put it in your report to support your opinion that he had diabetes, which supports your opinion that that's a factor in the gliosis?
The records indicate that he was diagnosed with diabetes in 2007.
Who made the diagnosis?
I don't recall. It's in the medical records by treaters.
And was he treated for his diabetes?
I'd have to go back and see.
But you pulled that out of the record, and you came to the conclusion that he had diabetic neuropathy, and that supported your conclusion that he had gliosis from other etiologies other than a blow to the head.
That misstates your testimony.
No. I mean, I know that he has a 30-year history of high blood pressure, and I know that high blood pressure leads to white matter lesions on brain imaging, as does diabetes. In the records, I saw references to him being diagnosed with diabetes in 2007, references to peripheral neuropathy. I did not make that diagnosis.
The point I'm making with you, ma'am, so the jury understands, you pulled out of the record a reference to diabetes, and then you pulled out of the record a reference, I think somewhere, of a tingling in the hands. You concluded it was diabetic neuropathy.
Well, that'd be the most likely explanation. I think I also referred to carpal tunnel, but certainly if you've had carpal tunnel, peripheral neuropathy, and you're having tingling in your hands, those would be the considerations as to what's leading to it.
Doctor, you came to the conclusion, did you not, that he had diabetic neuropathy?
Objection X, then answer. Misstates your testimony.
In the records, I saw that he was diagnosed with diabetes and peripheral neuropathy. I didn't come to a conclusion. I found it in the records.
In your search of the record, did you see that he had EMG studies that were consistent with carpal tunnel syndrome, not neuropathy from diabetes?
I know that there were references to carpal tunnel syndrome. I'm not qualified to interpret EMG reports.
Why did you not put in your report that his tingling in the hands may be from a carpal tunnel syndrome? The only thing you put in there, ma'am, was diabetic neuropathy.
Well, in my experience and knowledge, certainly when you've got tingling and you know in the records that it talks about peripheral neuropathy, that would be the #1 consideration.
I see.
Whether or not carpal tunnel syndrome leads to tingling, I have less experience with.
The diabetic neuropathy sure sounds like a careless mistake in his medical records. I've seen that over and over, that people are careless or they just flat out make a mistake somehow. A brief example is when I was hospitalized, a doctor described me as having a pituitary tumor, which is absolutely not true. But see how that could carry on to somebody else. It's not taking good records. And further, it doesn't sound like he may have had a blood pressure issue. That's questionable, you know, whether it was out of control. Her example is just off the charts. Unfair to say he has uncontrolled high blood pressure. But what I really want to point out is that she's disregarding all the factors that he had a severe head injury. You know, God bless the gentleman that he was making a pretty decent recovery, but she is in I would call it a confirmation bias. She's denying the facts to arrive at her own conclusion.
What is your definition of malingering?
Deliberate faking of symptoms for an external goal.
It's a conscious effort to deceive.
That's correct.
And that is a research interest of yours, isn't it?
That's correct.
And your research interest is detecting, I'll just say the word, liars who are trying to seek a monetary gain in a litigation context?
No, I'm trying to detect people who are deliberately faking symptoms for an external goal. That's the definition of malingering.
And that's one of your specialty areas also, isn't it?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by that. It's an area that I do research in.
Well, in terms of what you offer to people to hire you, one of your areas of expertise is the detection of malingering. Would that be a fair statement?
I don't think it is, because it's a part of every neuropsychological exam. So you don't just do an exam and the goal is detection of malingering. It's a part of a complete neuropsychological exam. So my specialty is neuropsychological testing.
Have you written a book on malingering?
It was on feigned cognitive impairment and how to assess for it.
What's the difference between feigned cognitive impairment and malingering? Is that just a nicer way to say it?
No, people can feign symptoms non-consciously for psychological reasons. So the purpose of the book was to show how non-credible symptoms could be detected, whether or not that is malingering.
In some of the reports that you generate for defense counsel, do you point out, if it's your opinion that there's a malingerer here, that you'll say so?
I usually don't use that term, but if there's compelling evidence for that, then I will.
Within the last month, have you used the term malingerer in a report that you prepared?
I don't recall, actually.
Within the last 2 months?
I don't recall.
How many reports do you do in a month or a week? Any time frame convenient to you?
I probably do maybe 3 or 4 a month.
And with all due respect, Doctor, saying Boone 2002 doesn't mean anything to me. So do you have all of your reference materials that you referred to in your reports?
Not with me, no. But the way that you find these, it's actually very easy. You just type in Google Scholar, and you type in the author's name, the year, and then like the general content area. So if it's referring to a test, you type in the name of the test. So it's actually very easy to find these things.
Well, I don't want to go through that exercise, and that's why I did the notice. You felt it was prudent to put in here, and I'll just read one. Research conducted at Harvard UCLA shows that depression is associated with mild losses in discrete cognitive areas. And then you go ahead and visual memory, PIQ, processing speed, executive skills. Boone, et al., 1995. Well, what would I type in Google?
You would type in Boone, 1995, and then depressive disorder.
Where's the report?
What report?
The one you referred to in this thing.
The publication?
Page 2, yeah. Boone, 1995. What's it called? Where's the article?
Well, it's in my Vita. Actually, if you go to my Vita, any article of mine that I published, you just, and you can type in the entire reference into Google Scholar and it will come up. So Boone 1995 is,
By the way, do you consider it good form to cite yourself in your reports?
I know that research the best.
Reports?
I know that research the best.
I very much appreciate how this attorney called her out on her confirmation bias. There's no other word for it. She wanted to arrive at a certain decision, and that's what she came up with. I also was amused that she even offered more with her self-righteous, kind of pompous attitude about all her wisdom in this. And the attorney keeps going. I really appreciate how he continued to put everything into perspective. We'll watch that next.
And currently, what are you doing professionally?
I'm a full professor at Alliant University in the particular school that's called the California School of Forensic Studies. I'm a full professor in that program. Then I also have a small private practice on the side where I do neuropsychological assessments.
And you make approximately $250,000 a year in your side practice?
I don't know. I don't think that much.
But doctor, do you recall signing a declaration under penalty of perjury that you made $250,000 a year in that practice?
Yes, I do.
Do you now recall that you make approximately $250,000 a year in your side practice?
That was the estimate I provided, but I really had no data to go on, so I had to provide it. That's what I turned over.
Well, doctor, you signed a declaration under penalty of perjury and advised the court, because it was a disputed issue, I'll say, in your deposition when you refused to answer that question. And you signed a declaration that you made $250,000 per year. Was that true?
According to my best estimate at the time, but I had no data to rely upon.
What's your feeling today? Do you make more than that or less than that?
I believe less than that.
What do you think you really make?
I don't know. I get a lot of 1099s from different sources, from book sales, from test sales, from doing workshops, medical legal work, criminal cases, at the request of disability insurance companies. And when the 1099s come in, I do not divvy them up into different categories. So I don't really know.
When you signed the declaration under penalty of perjury, did you appreciate that you were advising the court that this was true and accurate information, that you made $250,000 per year in your side practice?
That was the best estimate I had at that time. But again, I had no data to rely upon. I don't know if it's accurate or not.
Did you tell that to counsel, that you had no data to come to that number that
Yes,
you were
I did.
supplying?
And I was told I had to provide a number, so I provided a number in that program. Then I also have a small private practice on the side where I do neuropsychological assessments.
And you make approximately $250,000 a year in your side practice? In this case, the Rios matter, you were retained by defense counsel to assess Mr. Rios, correct?
That's correct.
And then you sent a bill for your professional services. I'll mark this next one. Where are we on? 4. That's a bill for $10,250. Have you billed anything since the $10,250?
I did on May 21st. I printed this.
Can I
Yes, you
attach
can
it?
have that. Yes.
We'll call it 5. This is your updated bill.
Yes.
So you charge an additional $2,000?
Correct.
You're charging me for your time today?
I am.
What's the charge?
$500 an hour.
Trial testimony?
$2,500 for a half day.
You're charging me for your time today?
I am.
What's the charge?
$500 an hour.
What time is it?
7:45, 10:07.
10 more minutes.
Well, you got me, so I have to say okay.
This was the earnings of Kyle Brower, Boone, PhD, for this particular case, a total of $13,250. It did not go to trial. It was settled out of court, and the plaintiff had, jumped through all the workman's comp hoops, and his lawsuit was lodged against the company making the equipment that injured him, and it was settled, instead of for $3 million, they settled for $2 million. And I would suggest some of the settlement is that they really, as Miss Boone demonstrated, they really didn't have a leg to stand on. The next slide will show from Kyle Brower Boone's website her current charges as of this week for being a, quote, expert witness, primarily for insurance company to discredit the injured party or the ill person. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And congratulations to that attorney to do such an excellent job. It's really, I find the whole thing unfortunate that I find this people like Miss Boone as a detriment to the system. It tags on a lot of expense unnecessarily. It's kind of hard on the system. Okay, thanks again for listening.
London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down. London Bridge is falling down, my fair lady. Build it up with sticks and stones, sticks and stones, sticks and stones. Build it up with sticks